In 1102 AD, on a barren hill overlooking the jewel of the Levantine coast, the good knight drove his spade into rocky soil and began to build a fortress that would take 7 years to finish its work, not through the thunder of a single battle, but through the slow, patient starvation of an entire city. As Raymond IV of Toulouse, the wealthiest and most stubborn of the First Crusades leaders, planted the foundations of Mons Peregrinus, the mountain of the Pilgrims, he set in motion the longest siege of the Crusader era, a grinding war of attrition that would birth the fourth and final Crusader state. This was not a story of glorious charges or desperate last stands, but of years spent watching, waiting, and enduring as the city of Tripoli, home to 4,000 silk looms, a library of 100,000 volumes, and the proud Banu Ammar dynasty, slowly withered under the weight of Frankish ambition. Watch as the good knight survives not just the clash of steel, but the far deadlier enemies of hunger, disease, and time itself, as he witnesses the transformation of a sophisticated Islamic emirate into a Latin county carved from patience and iron will. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive journeys through history's greatest turning points, where our silver-armored knight walks beside you through the slow unfolding of empires, told with the pacing perfect for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which prolonged campaign or forgotten siege you'd like the good knight to endure next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to the year 1102, when the work of conquest began not with a roar, but with the quiet scrape of stone on stone. Chapter 1. The Hill and the Dream. The good knight stood on the crest of a nameless hill, 2 miles east of Tripoli's walls, and felt the Mediterranean wind pull at the edges of his silver cloak. Below him, the city sprawled across its peninsula like a jewel set in blue. White limestone buildings catching the afternoon sun, minarets rising above red-tiled roofs, the harbour crowded with ships from Egypt, Sicily, and Byzantium. Smoke from 1,000 cooking fires drifted lazily upward. The call to prayer echoed across the distance, a sound he had grown accustomed to in the 2 years since Jerusalem fell. He had marched with Raymond of Toulouse since the beginning. Through the snows of Anatolia, the scorching plains of Syria, the blood-soaked streets of Ma'ara and Antioch. He had watched Raymond refuse the crown of Jerusalem on grounds of piety, watched him quarrel with Bohemond and Godfrey, watched him grow bitter as younger, less wealthy men claimed kingdoms while he remained a count, without a county. Now Raymond stood beside him on this hill, an old man of 60 winters, his beard more silver than gold, his eyes still sharp with ambition. Around them, a few hundred Frankish knights and foot soldiers were already at work, digging foundations, hauling timber brought by Genoese ships, marking out the perimeter of what would become a fortress. "This," Raymond said, his voice hoarse from years of shouting commands, "will be called Mons Peregrinus, the mountain of the Pilgrims." He gestured toward the city below. "And from here, we will watch Tripoli die." The good knight said nothing. He had learned that Raymond's grand pronouncements often preceded years of hard labor, but he understood the logic. Tripoli controlled the coastal road between Antioch and Jerusalem. As long as it remained in Muslim hands, the Crusader states were divided, vulnerable, forced to communicate by sea or risk ambush on the inland routes. Raymond had tried to take the city by storm in the spring and failed. 7,000 of the city's defenders had died in that assault, but the walls held, and the Banu Ammar, the Berber dynasty that ruled Tripoli, had proven far more resilient than expected. So Raymond had changed his strategy. If the city could not be taken quickly, it would be taken slowly. The good knight turned his attention to the work at hand. Byzantine engineers sent by Emperor Alexios Komnenos as a gesture of support for his most loyal Crusader ally were directing the construction. They had brought plans, measurements, and a shipment of cut stone from Cyprus. The fortress would be more than a simple wooden palisade. It would be a permanent structure, capable of withstanding counterattacks and housing a garrison through the winter. He joined a work crew hauling stones up the slope. The labor was backbreaking. The sun was merciless. Sweat soaked through the padded gambeson he wore beneath his mail, and by evening his hands were raw despite his gloves. This was the reality of siege warfare that the songs never mentioned. Not the glory of battle, but the endless grinding work of construction and supply. As the sun set, casting Tripoli in shades of gold and purple, the good knight sat on a half-finished wall and ate his ration of bread and dried fish. Around him, other soldiers did the same, their conversations a mix of French, Provençal, Italian, and the broken Arabic they had all begun to learn. Some spoke of home, others spoke of the wealth that would be theirs when the city finally fell. A few spoke of the library inside Tripoli's walls, the Dar al-Ilm, which was said to hold more books than any city in Christendom. The good knight thought of the years ahead. He thought of the walls of Tripoli, which would not fall easily. He thought of the Banu Ammar, who had ruled this coast for a generation and would not surrender without exhausting every option. He thought of the Fatimids in Egypt, who would surely send fleets to relieve the city. And he thought of Raymond, who was old and wounded and might not live to see his dream fulfilled. But he also thought of the hill beneath him, and the fortress rising stone by stone, and the simple, terrible logic of a blockade. Tripoli could be resupplied by sea, but not forever. Tripoli could call for help, but help might not come, and Tripoli, for all its wealth and learning, could not move. Mons Peregrinus could wait. And so the good knight settled in for what he knew would be a long, slow war. Chapter 2. The Rhythm of the Siege. The first year passed in a blur of labor and skirmishes. By the autumn of 1102, the fortress of Mons Peregrinus was complete enough to house a permanent garrison. Its walls were thick, its towers commanded the approaches to Tripoli, and its gates faced both the city and the road to the interior. Raymond established his headquarters within, and began to issue charters and decrees as if he were already Count of Tripoli, in fact, not merely in ambition. The good knight was assigned to the eastern tower, which overlooked the road to Homs. His duty was to watch for relief forces from the Syrian interior, armies from Damascus, Homs, or Aleppo that might attempt to break the siege. It was tedious work. Days would pass with nothing but the wind and the distant sounds of the city. Then, without warning, a column of horsemen would appear on the horizon, and the alarm would sound, and the garrison would scramble to arms. Most of these skirmishes were brief and inconclusive. The Muslim forces, often small raiding parties rather than full armies, would probe the Crusader positions, test their defenses, and withdraw before a pitched battle could develop. The good knight learned to read the dust clouds, to distinguish between a merchant caravan and a war band, to sleep lightly and wake quickly. But the rhythm of the siege was not defined by violence. It was defined by routine. Each morning, the garrison assembled for prayers. The chaplain, a Benedictine monk from Provence, led them in the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The good knight knelt with the others, his hands folded over the pommel of his sword, and felt the strange comfort of ritual in a foreign land. After prayers came the distribution of rations. Bread, baked in ovens built into the fortress walls. Salted pork, brought by Genoese ships. Dried figs and dates, purchased from local farmers who had quickly learned that the Franks paid in silver. Wine, which was plentiful in the vineyards of the Lebanon mountains. The good knight had grown accustomed to the Levantine diet. Less beer and more wine, less butter and more olive oil, less cabbage and more citrus. It was strange at first, but no longer. Then came the work. There was always work, repairing walls damaged by storms, digging latrines, hauling water from the springs on the hillside, tending to the horses, sharpening weapons, drilling with sword and spear. The good knight had been a warrior for most of his life, but he had also become a laborer, a builder, a keeper of routines. In the afternoons, when the heat was too great for heavy labor, he would sit in the shade of the tower and watch the city. Tripoli did not look like a city under siege. Its markets were still open. Its harbor was still crowded with ships. Its walls were still intact. But the good knight knew that appearances could deceive. The blockade was working, slowly. Fewer caravans reached the city from the Maritime interior. Fewer ships dared to run the Genoese patrols. Prices inside the city were rising. The Banu Ammar were spending their wealth to keep their people fed, but wealth was finite. Time, the good knight thought, was the Crusaders' greatest weapon. In the spring of 1103, Raymond led a raid south along the coast and captured the town of GoodKnight, known to the Franks as Byblos, with the help of the Genoese admiral Hugh Embriaco. The town was small, but its capture was significant. It gave the Crusaders control of the coastal road south of Tripoli, further isolating the city. Hugh Embriaco was rewarded with the lordship of GoodKnight, and his family would hold it for generations. The good knight was part of the raiding force. The assault on GoodKnight was swift and brutal. The town's garrison, caught by surprise, fought fiercely but was overwhelmed. The good knight remembered the narrow streets, the smell of smoke and blood, the sound of women screaming as the Franks broke into their homes. He remembered the face of a young Muslim soldier, no older than 16, who had charged him with a spear and died on the good knight's sword before he could even cry out. War, the good knight thought, was not glorious. It was necessary, perhaps. It was commanded by God, perhaps. But it was not glorious. After GoodKnight fell, the Crusaders returned to Mons Peregrinus with their plunder: gold, silver, bolts of silk, sacks of grain. The mood in the fortress was jubilant. Raymond distributed the spoils generously, and for a few weeks the garrison ate well and drank better. But the jubilation faded. The siege continued. The city endured. In September of 1104, the defenders of Tripoli launched a major counterattack. The good knight was on watch in the eastern tower when the alarm bells rang. He grabbed his shield and sword and ran to the courtyard, where chaos reigned. Smoke was rising from the western wing of the fortress. The defenders had somehow set fire to one of the wooden structures inside the walls. At the same time, a large force of Muslim soldiers was assaulting the main gate with ladders and rams. The good knight joined the defense of the gate. The fighting was desperate and close. The attackers had brought siege ladders and were trying to scale the walls, while others battered the gate with a makeshift ram. The good knight stood on the battlements, hacking at the hands and heads of men trying to climb over. His sword rang against helmets and shields. His arms burned with exhaustion. Blood, his own and others, slicked the stones beneath his feet. Beside him, a Frankish knight took an arrow in the throat and fell backward without a sound. Another was pulled off the wall by a grappling hook and disappeared into the mass of attackers below. The good knight felt the cold clarity of survival take over. No thought, no fear, only action. Strike. Block. Strike again. Then from somewhere inside the fortress, a shout went up. Raymond had been wounded. The good knight did not see it happen, but later he heard the story. The count had been inspecting the burning wing when part of the roof collapsed, and he had fallen through into the flames. His guards had pulled him out, but he was badly burned and barely conscious. The news spread through the garrison like wildfire. For a moment, the good knight thought the defense would collapse. but the knights and sergeants held the line, and after an hour of brutal fighting, the attackers withdrew. The fire was extinguished. The gate held, but Raymond did not recover. Chapter 3. The Death of the Dreamer. Raymond IV of Toulouse died in February of 1105, within the walls of the fortress he had built. The good knight was not present at his deathbed. Only Raymond's closest retainers and the chaplain were allowed in the chamber, but he stood in the courtyard with the rest of the garrison as the bells tolled and the news was announced. The Count of Toulouse, the wealthiest and most stubborn of the First Crusades leaders, the man who had refused the crown of Jerusalem and spent the last years of his life building a castle on a hill, was dead. The good knight felt a strange emptiness. He had not loved Raymond, few men did, but he had respected him. Raymond had been a man of vision, however flawed. He had seen what others had not, that Tripoli was the key to uniting the Crusader states, and that patience could achieve what force could not. But now Raymond was gone, and the question that hung over Mons Peregrinus was simple. What happens next? The answer came swiftly. The garrison elected William Jordan, Count of Cerdagne and Raymond's nephew, as their new leader. William Jordan was a capable commander, but he lacked Raymond's wealth and political connections. He also lacked Raymond's legitimacy. Raymond's eldest son, Bertrand, was still in Toulouse, governing his father's lands in France, and many believed that Bertrand was the rightful heir to the County of Tripoli. But Bertrand was far away, and William Jordan was here. So the siege continued. The good knight remained at his post in the eastern tower. The rhythm of the siege resumed, prayers, rations, watch. The city below endured. The blockade tightened. Time passed. In 1106, William Jordan led a successful defense against a relief army from Damascus. The good knight fought in that battle, a chaotic clash on the plains east of Mons Peregrinus. The Damascene cavalry was fast and disciplined, their horse archers circling the Frankish lines and loosing arrows in waves. But the Crusaders held their formation, and when the Muslim cavalry finally charged, the Frankish knights met them with lances and swords. The good knight remembered the impact of the charge, the shock of horse against horse, the splintering of lances, the screams of men and animals. He remembered unhorsing a Damascene emir, a man in fine armor with a green banner, and watching him fall beneath the hooves of his own retreating cavalry. He remembered the exhaustion that followed, the long march back to the fortress, the knowledge that they had won, but that the war was far from over. The siege continued. By 1108, the situation inside Tripoli had grown desperate. The good knight could see it from the tower. The harbor was quieter. Fewer ships came and went. The markets were less crowded. The city's ruler, Fakhr al-Mulk of the Banu Ammar, had left the city to seek aid from the Seljuk Sultan in Baghdad, but the Sultan was distracted by internal revolts and offered no help. In Fakhr al-Mulk's absence, the citizens of Tripoli, tired of waiting and fearing starvation, had effectively handed control of the city to the Fatimids in Egypt, who promised a relief fleet. But the fleet did not come, or rather it came too late. The good knight was on watch when the lookout shouted from the western tower. A fleet had been sighted, dozens of ships flying the banners of Genoa and the cross of the Crusaders. And at the head of the fleet was Bertrand of Toulouse, Raymond's eldest son, come at last to claim his inheritance. Bertrand arrived with 4,000 men and a massive Genoese fleet. He also arrived with a demand, that William Jordan step aside and recognize him as the rightful Count of Tripoli. William Jordan, supported by Tancred of Antioch, refused. For a few tense weeks, the Crusader forces outside Tripoli were divided. Two rival camps formed, one loyal to Bertrand, one loyal to William Jordan. The good knight, who had served under Raymond and then under William Jordan, found himself caught in the middle. He had no love for either man, but he understood that a civil war between the Crusaders would be a disaster. The Muslims inside Tripoli were watching, waiting for the Franks to tear themselves apart. The crisis was resolved by King Baldwin I of Jerusalem, who arrived in June with an army and summoned all the Crusader leaders to a council outside the walls of Tripoli. The good knight was not present at the council. He was a knight, not a lord, but he heard the outcome. The compromise was elegant and ruthless. The prospective county of Tripoli would be divided. William Jordan would hold the northern territories, Tortosa and Arca, as a vassal of Tancred of Antioch. Bertrand would hold the southern territories, Tripoli and Gibelet as a vassal of the king of Jerusalem. If either man died without an heir, the other would inherit his lands. It was a solution that satisfied no one and everyone, but it unified the Crusader forces for the final assault. Chapter 5. The tightening noose. With the arrival of Bertrand's fleet, the siege entered its final phase. For 7 years, the land blockade of Mons Peregrinus had strangled Tripoli's economy. But the city had survived through maritime resupply from the Fatimids in Egypt. Now, with the Genoese and Pisan fleets enforcing a complete naval blockade, that lifeline was cut. The good knight watched from the tower as the Italian ships patrolled the waters off Tripoli's harbour. Any vessel attempting to enter or leave was intercepted, boarded, and either captured or sunk. The harbour, once crowded with merchant ships, grew empty. The city's docks fell silent. Inside Tripoli, the situation became catastrophic. The good knight could not see inside the walls, but he could imagine it. Food running out, prices skyrocketing, people starving. The Banu Ammar's wealth, built over generations of trade, was being spent to keep the population alive. But wealth could not create food where there was none. Crusaders, meanwhile, prepared for the final assault. Siege engines were constructed, catapults and trebuchets, massive wooden structures that required teams of engineers and labourers to build. The good knight helped haul timber and rope, watched as the engineers calibrated the machines, felt the ground shake as the first stones were hurled toward the city walls. The bombardment was relentless. Day after day, the siege engines launched stones and flaming projectiles at Tripoli's defences. The walls, which had stood for centuries, began to crack. Towers collapsed. Sections of the battlements crumbled. The defenders tried to repair the damage, but they were exhausted, starving, and running out of materials. The good knight thought of the people inside the city. He thought of the children who had done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. He thought of the scholars in the Dar al-Ilm who had spent their lives preserving knowledge and who now faced the destruction of everything they had built. He thought of the soldiers on the walls who were defending their homes with the same courage that he and his fellow Crusaders claimed for themselves. War, the good knight thought, did not care about courage or righteousness. It only cared about who could endure the longest. Chapter 6. The fall on July 12th, 1109. The city of Tripoli surrendered. The good knight was in the courtyard of Mons Peregrinus when the news arrived. A delegation from the city had approached the Crusader lines under a flag of truce and negotiated terms with King Baldwin I. The king had promised safe conduct to the inhabitants. They would be allowed to leave with their lives and some of their possessions. The gates of Tripoli opened. The good knight was part of the force that entered the city. He walked through the gates with his sword drawn, his shield on his arm, his heart pounding. He expected resistance, a final desperate stand by the defenders. But there was none. The streets were empty. The people had already begun to flee, carrying what they could, bundles of clothing, sacks of grain, children in their arms. But the promises of safe conduct were not kept. The Genoese, eager for plunder, ignored King Baldwin's orders and began to loot the city. The good knight watched as they broke into homes, dragged people into the streets, stripped them of their possessions. He watched as soldiers who had spent 7 years waiting for this moment unleashed their frustration and greed on a defenseless population. He saw an old man beaten to death for refusing to surrender a small bag of coins. He saw a woman clutching a child, both of them screaming as they were pulled apart and sold to slave traders. He saw a group of Frankish knights laughing as they set fire to a row of houses, the flames leaping from roof to roof. The good knight did not participate in the sack. He stood in the street, his sword still in his hand, and felt a deep, cold shame. This was not the war he had signed up for. This was not the holy mission that Pope Urban had preached at Clermont. This was just cruelty, dressed in the language of righteousness. He walked through the city, past the burning buildings and the screaming crowds, until he reached the Dar al-Ilm. The library was already being looted. Soldiers were pulling books from the shelves, tearing pages, throwing volumes into the street. A priest, a Catholic cleric from one of the Italian contingents, was directing the destruction, shouting that the books were heretical, that they contained the words of the false prophet, that they must be burned. The good knight watched as thousands of volumes, works of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, poetry, were piled in the courtyard and set ablaze. The smoke rose into the sky, thick and black, carrying with it the knowledge of centuries. He thought of the scholars who had written those books, who had spent their lives in pursuit of understanding. He thought of the students who had studied in this library, who had come from across the Islamic world to learn. He thought of the future generations who would never read those words, never benefit from that knowledge, and he thought of the Crusaders who had destroyed it, who believed they were doing God's work. The good knight turned away from the burning library and walked back through the city. The sack continued for hours. By the time it was over, thousands of Tripoli's inhabitants were dead or enslaved. The wealth of the Banu Ammar, gold, silver, silk, spices, was divided among the Crusader leaders and their soldiers. The city itself, once a jewel of the Levantine coast, was a smoking ruin. But the County of Tripoli had been born. Chapter 7. The New Order. In the weeks following the fall of Tripoli, the Crusaders began the work of rebuilding and reorganization. Bertrand of Toulouse was formally invested as the first Count of Tripoli, swearing fealty to King Baldwin I of Jerusalem. The county was divided into several lordships. The Genoese, in recognition of their essential naval support, were granted 1/4 of the land around Tripoli and the city of Gibellet. Hugh Embriaco, the Genoese admiral, became the Lord of Gibellet, establishing a dynasty that would rule the city for generations. William Jordan, who had commanded the siege after Raymond's death, was granted the northern territories of Tortosa and Arca as a vassal of Tancred of Antioch. But the compromise did not last. Within months, William Jordan was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Some said assassinated on Bertrand's orders, others said killed by bandits. Regardless, Bertrand inherited his lands, becoming the sole ruler of the County of Tripoli. The good knight remained in the county for several months, stationed at Mons Peregrinus, which had been transformed from a siege fortress into the administrative center of the new state. He watched as the Crusaders rebuilt the city, repaired the walls, and established markets and churches. He watched as the surviving Muslim population was either expelled or reduced to second-class status, forbidden from bearing arms or owning property within the city walls. He watched as the Latin East became a reality, a patchwork of Frankish kingdoms and counties held together by feudal oaths and the constant threat of Muslim counterattack. But he also watched as the Crusaders adapted to their new home. They learned to eat the local food, to speak the local languages, to navigate the complex politics of the region. They married local women, Greek, Armenian, even Muslim converts. They built churches in the Eastern style, with domes and mosaics. They hired Muslim and Jewish craftsmen, merchants, and scribes. The good knight thought of Raymond of Toulouse, who had dreamed of this moment but had not lived to see it. He thought of the 7 years spent on the hill, the slow, patient work of the siege. He thought of the thousands who had died, Crusaders and Muslims alike, to make this county a reality. And he thought of the library, burning in the courtyard of the Dar al-Ilm, and wondered if the price had been worth it. Chapter 8. The Long Watch. The good knight remained in the County of Tripoli for another year, serving in the garrison at Mons Peregrinus and participating in several campaigns to secure the county's borders. He fought in skirmishes against raiders from Homs and Damascus. He helped construct new fortifications along the inland frontier. He watched as the county slowly stabilized, as trade resumed, as the scars of the siege began to heal. But he also felt the weight of the years. He had been fighting for nearly a decade, first in the march across Anatolia, then in the sieges of Antioch and Jerusalem, and finally in the long, grinding siege of Tripoli. He had seen more death than any man should see. He had done things he was not proud of. He had survived when so many others had not. In the spring of 1110, he requested permission to leave the county and travel south to Jerusalem. Bertrand, who had no particular attachment to him, granted the request. The good knight packed his few belongings, his armor, his sword, a small bag of silver coins, and joined a caravan heading down the coast. As he rode away from Mons Peregrinus, he looked back one last time at the fortress on the hill. It stood solid and permanent, a monument to Raymond's vision and the Crusaders' perseverance. Below it, the city of Tripoli was slowly coming back to life, new buildings rising, new people arriving, new stories beginning. The good knight turned his horse south and rode toward Jerusalem, toward whatever the future held. He had survived the siege of Tripoli. He had witnessed the birth of the fourth Crusader state. He had seen the best and worst of what men could do in the name of God and glory. And he knew, with a certainty born of experience, that the war was far from over. The Latin East was fragile. The Muslim powers were regrouping. The Crusader states were divided by rivalries and ambitions. The peace that had been won at such great cost would not last. But for now, Good knight rode south under a clear sky, the Mediterranean sparkling to his left, the mountains rising to his right, and felt the strange, bittersweet relief of a soldier who has survived another campaign. He had endured, and he would endure again. Epilogue. The legacy of the siege. The County of Tripoli would endure for 180 years, finally falling to the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun in 1289. The city itself was destroyed to prevent its recapture, its walls torn down, its buildings razed. The Crusader presence on the Levantine coast came to an end, but the memory of the siege remained. Historians would remember it as the longest siege of the Crusader era, a testament to the power of patience and the brutality of medieval warfare. They would remember Raymond of Toulouse, who died before his dream was realized. They would remember the Banu Ammar, who defended their city with courage and dignity. They would remember the Dar al-Ilm, whose destruction symbolized the cultural cost of the Crusades. And they would remember the soldiers like the good knight, who spent 7 years on a hill watching a city die, and who carried the weight of that experience for the rest of their lives. The siege of Tripoli was not a single battle. It was a war of attrition, a test of endurance, a slow, grinding process that reshaped the map of the Levant. It was a story not of heroes and villains, but of ordinary men caught in the machinery of history, doing what they believed was necessary and living with the consequences. The good knight survived. He always survived. But survival, he had learned, was not the same as victory.